Hello, this is the first section of the reading assignment for Unit 1, The Mystery of Human Language. Linguists have found over 7,100 languages across the globe, although it's difficult to be sure what the exact number is. But here you have a map where each tiny red dot represents a language. And one could ask, why is there not just one human language? That's not at all a trivial question. In fact, one could begin by asking, why does language exist at all? If language is what separates us from all other animals, the fact that it only developed in humans evokes further questions like, how did it evolve and why only in humans? These are some of the questions that linguists and biologists have not been able to answer with absolute certainty. However, there is some consensus that language appeared fairly recently in human evolution, and that humans and their languages originated in Africa, from where they spread across the globe. For a long time, humans depended entirely on their ability to address such questions through myth, by inventing stories. In the same way humans explained thunder as the angry thrashing of the gods, they invented stories about the origin of the many languages that exist in the world, and one such idea is the story of the Tower of Babel. According to this story, our many different languages are the punishment for building a tower that reaches into the heavens. And as it turns out, the towers in the ancient city of Babylon were indeed observatories to study the stars. So the idea that humans' ambitions to study the secrets of the universe were punished with linguistic diversity was plausible for a long time. More recently, scientists have developed theories, of course, about the evolution of language and the evolution of linguistic diversity. So language as a phenomenon is one thing, but then the diversity, the many, many different languages that we call linguistic diversity, is yet another issue. We know quite a few facts about our human ancestors based on archaeological and historical evidence, but much remains hidden in the past. There is some consensus among biologists and linguists that language evolved roughly 80,000 to 100,000 years ago. And this is not a long time in terms of evolution. Physical anthropologists like Robert McCarthy, actually former anthropologist here at FAU, who reconstructed the physiological limitations of Neanderthals, recently established that they were not capable of making the speech sounds that we associate with natural human languages today. So the Neanderthals are a species related to our direct ancestors who lived roughly between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. But they could not make the sounds that we can make. Where and how speech evolved in the history of man is still a matter of scientific debate. While we don't know what our earliest ancestors looked like exactly and how human natural languages came about, we know that they did not always have speech the way we do. Our ancestors' brains were smaller, their teeth sharper, their jaws more powerful than ours, but they were not able to use their organs for speech the way we can. So the reconstruction of what languages looked like in the past was the main interest of linguists during the 19th century. By comparing manuscripts from different time periods, they formulated hypotheses about how languages changed over time. Like archaeologists or biologists, they looked for homologies, similarity patterns, in samples from different times and places in order to reconstruct how languages were related. Their fossils, so to speak, were ancient written texts. Unfortunately, the oldest written evidence of human language does not go much further back than about 5,000 years. So what you see in this graphic representation here is, if you look at Indic represented by Sanskrit or Greek, Latin, this is no older than a few thousand years, but this reconstructed language that perhaps no longer exists, that they called Proto-Indo-European, is a hypothesis that there was one language, or as one linguist formulated it, that all of these different languages have sprung from a common source, is still only a hypothesis. So the so-called comparative method allowed 19th century linguists to group languages into families according to the patterns they identified. The hypothesis that languages like English, Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit are related was really what 19th century linguists were all about. They identified patterns of this reconstructed language called Indo-European by comparing all the manuscripts and inscriptions that were known at the time. And the linguist August Schleicher is credited with drawing the first family tree of the Indo-European languages. Part of the excitement for linguists in the 19th century was a romantic search for the origins of their own cultures. So there was a sense that languages are intimately tied to the people who speak them, and the linguistic reconstruction of the origin of, say, English was a way to uncover the origin of a particular cultural history through the comparative study of the languages of the assumed Germanic ancestors. And this turned out to be difficult because the names for languages and peoples can change easily. And what actually is a language is more complicated, as I mentioned before, and we'll discuss it. So the peoples who spoke the languages that could be considered the origins of English, say 6,000 years ago, lived somewhere in Northern Europe, but there's no written evidence of these Germanic languages until much later, when Europe became Christianized. So we have a pretty good idea of how our ancestors lived 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. This, for instance, is a beautiful museum on Lake Constance that reconstructs a Stone Age village with all the tools and food preparation, and those are experimental archaeologists who build all the tools that Stone Age people had, clothes and all these practices of domesticating animals and preparing food and weapons and how they treated illnesses and buried their dead. All of this is known, but of their language we have no record until much later. So these ancestors of the Germanic tribes that were documented much later, we know lots of aspects of their life, but none of their language. So one of the greatest mysteries looking back on the evidence of older languages, such as Hittite, here's one of the oldest attested languages, or Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, is that the further back we look in time, the more complex linguistic systems look. In other words, the oldest written texts that are available to us reveal languages of greater complexity than, for instance, modern English or French. The question for what lies before the written record of languages remains in the dark. How did languages evolve from nothing to complex systems like Sanskrit, Latin, or Greek, or Hittite in this carved in this stone right here? From the written record that is known to us, languages seem to have gone through a few thousand years of nothing but simplification. The evolution from unstructured vocalizations to a complex language can again only be hypothesized based on what we know about language change in the attested periods. Linguists are still developing theories about how linguistic systems go through their evolutions of becoming more complex or getting simplified. The idea of a language as a static system is certainly unrealistic, which makes it difficult to conceive of any historical data as representative of a language. For most languages, their origin lies forever hidden in the past, because even today, only 200 of the roughly 7,000 languages have writing systems. So the next section will be about how to reconstruct a particular language from ancient manuscripts.